Alright guys, in this video we're going to talk about energy resources and the difference between a renewable and non-renewable energy resource. Alright, so what an energy resource is a way for us to create power that can be used to accomplish a certain task. Alright, so if you want to maybe pause the video real quick and think about this question, why do we need energy resources in our everyday lives? Alright, so the reason we need energy resources is to help us accomplish the tasks that we want to do on an everyday basis. So many different things in our lives require energy. If we want to power the electrical gadgets that we have, iPads, laptops, anything like that, all requires energy. If we want to drive cars, if we want to even ride a bicycle, right? Everything requires energy to produce, and then many things require energy to be used. Right? So energy resources are necessary because if we want to live the way we currently live with all of this technology, we need energy resources to power those lifestyle aspects. All right? So the difference first we need to know is between a renewable and non-renewable energy resource. All right, so a non-renewable energy resource is an energy source that basically gets used up faster than we can replenish it, or faster than we can create new energy from this resource. All right, so an example of a non-renewable energy resource would be fossil fuels. All right, so this is a little very simplified example of how carbon is cycled through the environment. So basically, fossil fuels come from deep, deep within the ground here. We're going to talk about more about fossil fuels in a minute, but in order for fossil fuels to replenish themselves, it takes millions and millions and millions of years for a lot of this carbon that we have from decaying plants and things like that to basically get compressed and compressed deep underground over time, and that eventually could create different types of fossil fuels. Right? But that process takes so long that we are using fossil fuels right now at a much faster rate than the fossil fuel process can replenish itself. Right? So eventually fossil fuels are going to run out, and that's the key with a non-renewable resource, is that eventually it's going to run out because we're using it faster than we can replace it. Right? Whereas a renewable resource is something that we can replace at an equal or faster rate than we're using it up. So for example, wind energy, solar energy, these are renewable resources because if we really invested in those technologies, we would have as much energy as we could possibly use. All right? So a renewable resource is something that is not going to run out, right? The sun is still going to come up tomorrow. It's going to be windy most days, at least to a small extent, especially if you put a wind turbine in a very windy area. All right, so the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. Non-renewable resources, we can't create them, we can't replenish them as fast as we're using them, and eventually they will run out. Whereas renewable resources, they do not run out. They come from sources that we will always have available to us. Okay, so a couple different types of energy resources we're going to talk about here. So first, fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, they're made naturally over long periods of time, like I talked about, from decaying plant matter and other organic matter that gets compressed and compressed deep underground, and basically will create these fossil fuels over a long period of time. That's a very simplified explanation, but that's basically all you need to know for our purposes. All right, so there's a few different types of fossil fuels: coal, natural gas, and which is down here, and petroleum, which is crude oil, if you've ever heard of that. Right, so all of these are different types of fossil fuels. Certain types of fossil fuels burn more cleanly than others. For example, natural gas burns a little more cleanly than coal, which is one of the dirtiest fossil fuel sources. But there are a lot of problems with fossil fuels. Even the best fossil fuels that we have, whether it's natural gas or propane or things like that, that people tend to consider as clean fossil fuels, they still provide plenty of problems. The first of which being pollution. When you burn fossil fuels, it naturally is always going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Even when people talk about these, something like natural gas, which many people try and refer to as a clean fossil fuel source, it still releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when you burn it. So when we talk about climate change is not really going to care whether it's coal burning or natural gas burning. Yes, we'll have some fewer emissions if it's natural gas, but the reality is, at the end of the day, burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and there's simply no getting around that. All right, so pollution and climate change are a big issue with fossil fuels, and the other issue is they're a non-renewable resource, right? So eventually, if we were to use all the fossil fuels that we have in the world, which would result in environmental disaster, if we were to do that, fossil fuels would eventually run out, and we would still have to try and find an alternative solution to using fossil fuels in the form of a renewable energy resource. All right, so fossil fuels have served us very well for hundreds of years in that they've allowed us to, advance a lot of technologies, and we wouldn't have the world that we have today without them. But this has come with a ton of problems. The climate change issue that we're facing right now is almost solely due to the burning of fossil fuels, the excessive burning of fossil fuels over the past few hundred years. All right, so fossil fuels are a non-renewable resource that pose a lot of problems to our society. Some alternatives to fossil fuels, some renewable resources we can talk about. Solar energy. If you guys have ever seen solar panels, maybe on someone's house, or sometimes they have fields with like solar arrays in them, just like solar panels on little stands. Solar energy is energy that we produce from sunlight using these solar panels, which the effect here is called the photovoltaic effect, and basically it takes sunlight and in these panels, and they have certain types of materials, usually involving silicon, and the sunlight basically will create a current, and that's how we can get electricity. When the sunlight comes into these panels, it can bump some electrons and get them moving, and when you have a moving current, then you can produce electricity from that. All right, so solar energy is great. It's a renewable resource because, again, the sun is going to come up every day, just like it has for the entire history of the Earth, right? So solar panels are great because they're a renewable resource, and they're also becoming a lot cheaper and are basically becoming comparable in cost to fossil fuels in terms of energy costs. Another example of a renewable resource would be wind energy. All right, so this, I'm sure we've all seen wind turbines somewhere along the line, right? So wind energy is energy that we're generating from these wind turbines. So basically the wind will blow and it will kind of spin these turbines around. And anytime you have a spinning turbine, you can make electricity. All right, so these wind turbines will generate electricity from the spinning turbines caused by the blowing wind. All right, another great example of a renewable resource, because again, if you put these wind turbines in a windy area, you'll always have wind the next day, or maybe we have some days that aren't as windy and you'll produce less electricity, but if you put these turbines in the right location, you're going to get a lot of electricity produced from them. Okay, another example of a renewable resource is hydroelectric power. So usually this comes from dams, right, where we will essentially take a body of water such as this and suppress its flow with a dam, and then channel the water down through the dam, and then it will spin turbines, and again we can produce electricity from the falling water. So this is a good example of a renewable resource as well, because as long as we don't have a terrible drought in the area where these dams are, we'll have the water flowing, and that can spin the turbines and produce electricity. All right, so another example of a renewable resource. Geothermal power is another example of a renewable resource. This is a little less common than, say, solar or wind or hydroelectric, but basically it uses the heat generated from the Earth. So inside the Earth we have a really, really hot molten core and a bunch of other layers inside the Earth that are also really hot. So we can, if we have certain spots in the Earth where some of that heat is able to escape, we can kind of harness that heat and create energy that way. So this is an example of a geothermal power harnessing plant, and it's another way that we can generate electricity from that heat. Another example of a renewable resource is biomass. So biomass is kind of a broad term and refers to any basically organic matter that we can use to create power. So an example of biomass could be as simple as wood. Right? We burn wood, we can produce heat or energy from that. But there are also some more advanced forms of biomass, such as algae. There's a lot of development going on now with algae-based fuels that have some potential in terms of being a clean energy resource. But a lot of biomass still has the same problem as fossil fuels, whereas we're producing greenhouse gases from burning them, right? So if you burn wood, you're producing carbon dioxide. Anytime you burn a fire like this, you're producing carbon dioxide in the process. That's a greenhouse gas that, again, is going to contribute to climate change. All right, so biomass, it has some potential if we could find the right biomass sources that maybe could burn cleanly and not release as much carbon dioxide into the air. But don't necessarily assume that just because biomass is a more renewable resource that it's automatically better, because again, burning wood, we still have the problem of releasing carbon dioxide into the air. Alright, thanks for watching this video on energy resources, and I'll see you in the next one.